It has been over a year since I initially posted a video I titled My Favorite Horror Book in Every Subgenre. And I am finally back with a part 2. So I have 11 new categories to share with you guys of books I have found favorites in. And some of them are very niche. Some of them might be a little bit made up. Maybe I made them up, but I have 11 categories to share with you guys. I believe I have 12 books because I know one of the categories I have 2 books for, but none of these categories are going to be the same from my previous video because I actually still stand by every one of those books holding the crown of my favorite in the subgenres of the initial video. So I will link that down below so you can see the categories I went through in that one. So this one's going to be a continuation with all new categories. I will say not every single one of these books are 5 stars, but all of these books are between 4 and 5 stars. And nonetheless, they are my current favorite in whatever subgenre I have them categorized in. Some of these books obviously will overlap with multiple subgenres, but I wanted to be able to talk about each of these and have them in their own little category. So let's just jump right in. So the very first niche subgenre I have to share with you guys is tech. So I have found a 5-star tech horror book. Tech horror is obviously a subset of horror that specifically tackles technology. So this is quite an array. I found I tend to enjoy a more vintage style tech horror book. I'm very iffy with anything with AI or just super modern tech or even futuristic tech is a little iffy for me. I really like vintage tech. So my current favorite tech horror book is Teleportism by Joshua Milliken. This is actually a novella in the Killer VHS series by Shortwave Publishing. It's a series of novellas where every book is written by a different author, and it's pretty much equivalent to Goosebumps for adults. In the story, there is a VHS tape that if you watch it, it will actually teleport you 6 feet in either direction. And the feeling you get after this is very euphoric, very akin to kind of like a high. So the book is kind of set up like short stories, not really, but every chapter you're following a different group of people at a different time period. And it's how all these different people's interactions with this VHS tape go and overlap, and I thought it was a very fun time. It's a bit more comedic in a lot of ways, a little bit more zany, and we just blip in and out of multiple characters over the years and how these stories end up connecting. There are some characters that we revisit a few times, so we see how their stories change over time, but I thought it was a really fun story. It took a minute for me to get into it, to get into the different style of it that I wasn't really used to. I am a character-driven reader, so I love to stick with characters throughout a whole story. So it took me a second to get used to the fact that we weren't really here for characters, but more so this overarching story that has to do with this VHS tape. But I loved the nostalgic twist to having a VHS tape in general. And there's also this touch of, I don't want to say, like, I have a different category later on for addiction specifically. This book doesn't necessarily talk about addiction in terms of having a deep philosophical conversation about it. In fact, in this book, some of the characters, drugs are cool. Drugs are cool in this book. But at the same time, you do see the consequences of some of these people that get way into repeatedly watching this tape and kind of the ramifications of that. And I thought it took that in a very interesting direction, so I really liked how that tied into the story. There's a lot of really good body horror in this book as well. It doesn't get super gory, but it is still body horror nonetheless. So I thought that that was really interesting. So if you're somebody who wants to maybe get into more body horror, but you don't really want to read really intense descriptions of blood or gore or really festering things or anything like that, I feel like this is a really good place to kind of dip your toes into body horror because stuff happens to people's bodies, but it's just not as gruesome, I guess. Like it is, but it isn't. You know what I mean? Like there's not a ton of blood, there's not a ton of fluids or anything like that. So I feel like it's a very approachable style to body horror. It's a little bit more campy in that way. There's actually a specific chapter, it was like my favorite chapter of the whole book, where it felt very reminiscent of the movie The Fly, which arguably is a bit more intense body horror, but that particular chapter I really loved. So overall, I had a really fun time with the story. Loved how it all connected. It gets a little bit weird at the end, a little bit bizarre, I guess. It gets a little bizarre at the end, okay? But I enjoyed it. I was equally laughing and entertained while also being disturbed, and I thought it did that balance very well. I highly recommend this one. It's my current favorite tech horror. Next one is a category I never thought I'd really talk about and have a favorite book in, let alone have a 5-star book in. That is extreme horror. So extreme horror is not something I read very much. I did a extreme horror reading vlog specifically to celebrate hitting 8K subscribers, and what a journey that was. And I was so incredibly surprised to find a book that I really loved in there. Now I will say there is a big difference between extreme horror and splatterpunk horror, of which I did not know at the time of creating that reading vlog. I have since learned a lot more about splatterpunk and extreme horror specifically. So the big difference between splatterpunk and extreme horror is splatterpunk is supposed to be a little bit more of a commentary piece. It's supposed to have a bigger picture. It's supposed to have a little bit more thematically going on, whereas extreme horror is the type of horror that kind of just exists to be gross, disturbing, nasty, all of the things, to be very shock value types of reads, which honestly in my head I had those two definitions completely switched. Extreme horror to me just, it sounds less extreme, even though it's extreme. It sounds less extreme. Splatterpunk sounds intense to me. So I had the definitions mixed in my head, but extreme horror is very much just kind of gross out to be gross out, you know? So I do surprisingly have a favorite extreme horror that I gave 5 stars. And this is a very unpopular opinion right off the bat. But my favorite extreme horror is 100% Match by Patrick Harrison III. In the story, which this story is very short. I forget how long it is, but it's definitely under 150 pages. It might be under 100 pages. It's very short. In the story, we follow our main character, Bart, and he seems kind of normal, bald, pudgy, looking for a girlfriend. He seems unassuming, but he is anything but. He is extremely unhinged, extremely disturbed for a character. He actually kind of reminds me of Dwight Schrute from The Office, but like actually 10 times worse, even though Dwight Schrute has some like questionable characteristics. But Bart, oh wait, am I calling him Bart? His name is Bert. Whatever, very similar, different vowel, Bert. Bert is our main character, my bad, Bert. But he is deranged, okay? But the way that the story was set up, the structure of the story, I just had such a fun time with because it felt very satirical to me. It felt very comedic. It was crazy and outrageous, but to the point that it felt a little bit more campy for me. So I think that's why I enjoyed it. While it was gross and disturbing, don't get me wrong, you weren't marinating in the gross and disturbing. We'd be following Bert, who works at a fast food restaurant, and if you read this book, you will not want to read fast food for maybe ever, but he works in a fast food restaurant and he's doing seemingly normal things and thinking somewhat normal things, socially awkward, but somewhat normal things, and then all of a sudden he'll do something that is so out of pocket and so insane to think that there are people who are walking around and could be doing these things and having these thoughts. So I really just enjoyed the very suddenness of the disturbing stuff, and you would just get it and then we'd move on. And you weren't marinating in pages and pages and pages of somebody being assaulted or tortured or whatever. It just wasn't that. It was very quick to the point. So while it was gross and disturbing, it just wasn't overly so because of how quickly we moved on from every single part of this book. It felt very self-aware in that way. It felt like it was very much mixing outrageousness and disturbing elements and a humorous tone. So I enjoyed the balance of that. I think if I ever pursue more extreme horror, I need it to be a little bit more of that zany, campy, so outrageous that it's comical type of extremity. I had fun with this one. It was a 5-star read, surprisingly. Next, I wanted to bring this up because I talked about wanting to pursue more books, more horror books that tackled addiction in my part 1 of this series. So I'm specifically creating an addiction niche subgenre for this, and I have since found a book that very much fits this, and that is Ghost Eaters by Clay McLeod Chapman. I loved this book so much. This was a 5-star book for me. So in the story, we are following a group of 4 friends, 2 of which are on again, off again relationship wise. So they have a little bit deeper feelings for each other. But we are following our main girl, Erin, and she has this relationship with Silas in the group. And Silas deals with addiction. Right off the bat, I really enjoyed, one, the voice of Erin. I really liked her as a character. She's flawed, but very relatable to me. So I really enjoyed her as a character and her voice, and the fact that we were having the story through her lens. So really enjoyed the characterization, and the fact that the story starts with kind of this dynamic, exploring this dynamic between an addict and a non-addict, and what it feels like and what it's like, I guess, to love an addict. It's a very difficult thing, where you have to figure out where you're going to draw the lines. You want to be there for them, but they're in active addiction. So it's all very complex and very complicated. And I really enjoyed that we start the story with Erin having that dynamic. But very early on in the book, Silas does end up ODing. And with this comes a lot of grief and pain for Erin, as you would expect. So this does overlap with kind of grief horror, as well as paranormal. There is some paranormal stuff going on in the story as well. But Silas overdoses, and right before he overdoses, he was taking this drug called Ghost. And he was saying that when you take this drug, you can actually communicate with dead people and see ghosts. And he was taking it in hopes of reconnecting with his mother, who he lost very traumatically when he was young. So that's why he was taking it, ends up ODing. So then in her grief and desperation, Erin and her friends start taking this as well to try to reconnect with Silas. Then the story really becomes this journey, Erin's journey of addiction, where initially, she was just loving an addict, and now she herself has become an addict. Now, as I said, there is also some paranormal stuff going on, so the lines end up getting very blurred between what is happening because our character is actively taking drugs and what is happening with this paranormal thing going on as well. So the lines become very hazy between those two aspects, which I really enjoyed. There's a particular moment of this book where I feel as though it was Erin reaching rock bottom, and it gets extremely bizarre, very fever dream. The lines are non-existent at that point of what's actually happening and what is kind of a delusion or drug-induced hallucination. You really don't know, but overall, I just really enjoyed not only the structure and the journey of this story, but the symbolism. There's a lot of great symbolism throughout the story, as well as there were some genuinely creepy and unsettling moments where that paranormal stuff came into play. There was some moments where I was genuinely creeped out, which does not happen to me very often when I'm reading books. And I just thought overall it was very effective. Again, with that addiction aspect, I personally might latch on to this type of story more because addiction is something that I have personal connections with. So I feel a little bit more attached to this character and attached to this subgenre because of that, but I just thought it was very well done. It felt very genuine and it hit home for me, so I really, really loved this story. Next subgenre is psychological. So this one's one of those a little bit more gray area, a little bit more of one of those categories that I feel like a lot of books kind of overlap with, but I wanted to put this as one of the categories I talk about because I want to talk about this specific book that I never otherwise really have the opportunity to talk about. It is also technically, like, I googled it and it was listed as suspense horror, so this is kind of like psychological slash suspense. For me, it was very psychological. It kind of messed with me a lot, and that is Pen Pal by Dathan Auerbach. This book was so effective for me, and I was really surprised. This story actually started either as like a, I forget if it was a creepypasta or it was just like a Reddit story thing where the author had released various stories, okay? And this book is him, I don't know if he rewrote them to kind of make them all connect or what, but this is the book, the bind up of some of his stories. Whether they be rewritten or not, I don't know. But the book is structured as, I believe, 6 different parts, where overall we are following this man who is reflecting on some things that happened around him and to him as a child. And each part of this book is a different instance of that. And then at the end, they all connect. But the stories were just so unsettling. This book had me so on edge. The end, I was so creeped out by. I mean, multiple parts of this book, but the way it ties up, I feel like I got goosebumps. Like, it has stuck with me. I read this probably at least 2 years ago, if not more at this point, and I still think about how everything ended up connecting. And yeah, it really worked on me. It was very effective for me psychologically. And that's all I kind of want to say on that one. I feel like going into this one as blind as possible is the best way. But this so far is my favorite psychological / suspense horror book. Next is science horror. It could be also / sci-fi horror, but this one's a little bit more, to me, science rooted versus like sci-fi. I don't know. I think for me, I think of sci-fi a little bit more in space, which I know is probably like a totally different thing, or just like one aspect of sci-fi. But sci-fi, when I think of sci-fi, I think of more like space things or like futuristic stuff. This is a little bit more rooted in science, in terms of there's a lot of actual science in this book. So the book I'm talking about is Into the Drowning Deep by Myra Grant. I loved this book, but I have it under science because you need to like science or need to be interested in science, specifically biology and like marine, oceanic science. So back in the day, there was a documentary crew that went out on a ship in order to prove the existence of mermaids. But that ship and all of the crew ended up being lost at sea. All that was left was the footage they were taking that was transmitted to the, I don't know, the mothership was transmitted to the production company. And so the story opens up where there is this found footage of this crew seemingly being attacked by some type of sea creature and being dragged into the ocean. And it's up for debate if this video was a complete hoax, if it's real, if mermaids are real, and all that noise. So the story ends up following one of our characters who is actually the sister of the original crew, of somebody who was on the original documentary crew. It follows her along with a huge cast of other characters who are now going out on a second voyage to find the ship and to go back to the spot that that ship was lost at. A very large, vast majority of the people going on this mission are scientists. So we get a lot of science. We get a lot of marine biology. There's a person that studies mermaids and sirens and the existence of those. There's a person who studies, I don't know exactly what it's called, but it's kind of like linguistics with sea life. Like they listen to whale calls and stuff like that. And a bunch of other people. There's a bunch of subsets of ocean science represented in this book, and I thought it was so fascinating and so interesting. So that's why I say you have to like science, and that's why I have it under science, because there's quite a bit of nitty-gritty getting into that stuff. Not so much so that it's undigestible, but you have to be into it because this is a long book and it's very descriptive with that type of stuff. But there's also other characters. There's big game hunters on board, and I kind of forget everybody else. But yeah, there's a lot of characters, and I really enjoyed having that large cast of characters and kind of being able to go in and out of the ship at different locations at different times to kind of see what all was going on at the same time. There was a particular part of this book that I loved so much that very much reminded me of Arrival, the movie Arrival, and that communication barrier, and I enjoyed that so much. If you guys have any recommendations, this is like super niche, but if you guys have any recommendations of books that have kind of like this aspect of a communication barrier to overcome, let me know. Another book I can think of that's not horror that I read that has like that kind of element going on is Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. I really enjoy having that element, I feel like. I haven't read it very much, but every time I've had it in a book, I've loved it. So if you guys have any recommendations of any genre that has that, let me know, please. But anyways, with this book, my only issue with this book was it is so long and there was so much buildup to the point of getting to this spot that the original crew got lost at or whatever. There was so much buildup up to that point that I felt like the ending ended up being very rushed and very quick compared to how slowly building the rest of the story was. So that was my only issue with this book, was that the ending was just much more fast and jarring compared to the rest of the story. But overall, really love this book, obviously, so highly recommend. Okay, next category is cults, and I sadly still do not have a 5-star cult book. I don't know how. I have read quite a few, but I don't know what it is. I just have yet to find a 5-star book. So I actually have 2 books to share with you guys because they both were 4 stars. And both of these books, it's been a long time since I read them, so my memory is not super fresh. It might be, you know, a little outdated maybe at this point. I don't know. I'd have to reread them to know for sure. Well, except the one. But anyways, the first one is Little Eve by Catriona Ward. In the story, we're following a young girl who is being raised very isolated and sheltered and surrounded by these very radical beliefs, in which this cult believes that the adder is going to come and bring about the end of the world. And the adder is like this big sea serpent thing. And it takes place on a Scottish coastal setting, which I really enjoyed that aspect. And overall, I just remember it just felt like the type of cult story I wanted, where we follow a young girl who becomes a woman, but a young girl who is raised with these ideas and beliefs and slowly starts to kind of see the holes in the logic, and sees where she doesn't really agree with some of the stuff, and starts to slowly break apart her previous indoctrination. And I thought that it was really interesting how with that, there is also this element of them losing their identity. Their whole world is practically coming crashing down around them. So it's this idea of having to re-find yourself, rebuild yourself after disconnecting from all you have ever known, which is very hard to do. But I thought it handled that really well, and the deeper character exploration of that, and not so much just what this cult believed and did. While our character does have a lot of trauma behind that, and we do see some of that play out, it's not just focused on that, but more so a character trying to break out of that, while there's also some side elements going on. So the thing with Catriona Ward's books is I do enjoy a lot of them, but there's always seemingly some sort of subplot or side plot going on that seems almost like a totally different story. All I remember from this one is I know that there's like a side plot with this traveling circus thing. And that's all I remember. I feel like it probably didn't even go deep into it, but part of me wonders still why that was there, what that added. I don't know. I might have to reread this book to put that together a little bit more. But I know it's kind of become a pattern for me with Catriona Ward, where a lot of her books have this kind of side thing going on that seems unconnected in a lot of ways. And I feel like this had that element going on, which is probably why I gave it a lower star rating. But yeah, I overall remember feeling like I was glad the focus of the book was very much on a character. The other cult book that I gave 4 stars is Rites of Extinction by Matt Serafini. So this is a very short book. This is 150 pages, so I'm going to keep this super brief because I think, again, it's best to go into this with very little information. We follow our main character, Rebecca, who is a somewhat messy private investigator who decides to go on the hunt for her daughter's killer. This leads her down a very unexpected path. There's very much kind of secretive small town vibes, a lot of strange interactions, a lot of bizarre revelations that our character comes to and witnesses, and some really weird twists, I guess, end up happening as well. So the story does end up getting quite a bit bizarre, very trippy at the end, but it's best to go into this as blind as you can. Next subgenre I want to talk about is gothic. So these are books that are quite more atmospheric. They rely a lot more on an unsettling atmosphere, and while a lot of them are also a bit more historical, mine is actually modern. So mine has been listed as a modern gothic story. So I'm glad that I have a reason to put it in this category, because honestly, I was just going to put it in the super niche category of a book with a mother-daughter element going on. So if you want to get even more niche, this very much revolves around mother-daughter / just caretaker horror in general. But that book is Where I End by Sophie White. I love this book, and I will talk about it whenever I get the chance to. So this is a book I read this year, actually, and I'm so glad I did. In the story, we are following our main character. I don't really know how to say her name because this is also taking place at an Irish island setting. So I'm going to call her Aileen, but I don't think that's how you pronounce it, but we're going to call her Aileen. Anyways, so Aileen is actually one of the prime caretakers of her mother, whom something has happened to that we don't know, but it has left her in a state of complete dependence. She cannot walk, cannot talk, cannot move, cannot do anything for herself, cannot eat herself, anything. She is pretty much in a vegetative state. And in saying that, the author actually has a note in which she talks about the fact she had a parent who was in a vegetative state. So this book is very personally connected to the author. And you can tell because it feels so genuine, and this author is able to put into words feelings that are hard to put into words, period. But she does it in a way that feels very genuine, takes it to an upper degree, takes it to a very disturbing degree, but we'll get there. So we follow Aileen taking care of her mother, and she has a lot of various feelings about that. There's a lot of pent up rage, frustration, resentment that goes along with that. And our main character has that manifest in some very disturbing ways. This is quite a psychologically disturbing book. The way that our character decides to try to grasp at any type of connection that she feels like she's owed, like a parent, because even her dad just kind of comes to visit the island. So she feels owed some type of parental relationship, and the ends that she goes, how far she will take it to try to emulate that is very disturbing. She has quite a bit of obsessive tendencies, and alongside with this caretaker aspect, there is a woman who is new on the island, a temporary resident, and she has come to this island with a newborn baby, and our main character ends up inserting herself into this woman and this newborn's life in, again, very disturbing ways. But then it also links that conversation and storyline of having a newborn that is completely dependent on the mother, and how exhausting that could be, and stuff like that. So very much this overarching story of what it means to be completely dependent upon, what it means to be somebody's world, essentially. But it was so interesting because while Aileen does some extremely dark, disgusting things that you are not on board with, you also feel empathy for her. No character in this book is perfect. No character in this book is fully right or fully wrong. So it's very interesting how well the author was able to write a character that is so abhorrent, but at the same time you feel for her in a lot of ways, and you have empathy towards her, and you see why she feels the way she does. She just takes those feelings too far a lot of the time. And it circles back to kind of eventually finding out what really happened to the mother, and that kind of circles back to how much of ourselves we give, how much sacrifice, whether for the right or wrong reasons. That's up for a different discussion, but very, very interesting, very dark. So be in the mental space for this. I, unfortunately, but kind of fortunately, read this freshly postpartum. I went into this book blind, and I did not realize what the story was about to talk about and take on, really. So I probably read it at like the worst possible time to read it, but at the same time, I feel like I ended up latching onto the story a lot more because I could see some parallels. Trust me, not all the parallels, but I could see some parallels with what was going on in my current life. So it was an interesting time for me to have blindly picked this book up. Nonetheless, very beautifully written, dark, disturbing, but stunning. Next category is medical/experimental horror. This is also separate from Frankenstein-inspired stories, which I feel like is very much medical meets science meets gothic. So I have like Frankenstein-inspired stories separate, which I do talk about in my part 1 of this video. So I wanted to make this a little bit more specific to just medical and experimental in general. So I do have a current favorite. This is a subgenre that I want to explore more of. So again, if you have recommendations, please let me know. One that's on my TBR that I haven't read yet is Lakewood by Megan Giddings. I know that that's very experimental and medical, so that is on my radar, but I don't know that I have any others currently on my radar. But nonetheless, my current favorite is Intercepts by TJ Payne. And I'm very excited to talk about this one because I feel like it's very underrated, underhyped, and I've forced a lot of people to read it, okay? Because I really enjoy this one. In saying that, full transparency, the first time I read it, I don't know why, I gave it 3 stars. It's definitely at least a 4-star. And even in saying that, I feel like I need to reread it, and it might even be more than that because I still think about it to this day, and I again read it probably 2 years ago. So this book is following a man who worked at a secret facility, and we don't know what that facility did or anything like that. So he worked at a secret, he currently works at a secret facility, and he has a daughter, and that's kind of all I remember in terms of how much I want to tell you guys for the setup. Okay, but the very first chapter that this book opens up with, oh my god, you guys, it gave me such Clockwork Orange vibes, and the body horror, just again, right off the first chapter, the body horror is intense, and this also very much overlaps with psychological horror to me, because I don't really want to say too much because this is another one I feel like it's best to go in blindly, but there is quite a bit of psychological stuff going on, and the daughter ends up being pulled into this world. She ends up kind of getting caught up in this whole secret facility and what they're secretly doing with the people that they have captive in this facility, and all of that, and she ends up getting swept up in it. But I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna leave it at that. Just read it. It's good, okay? Just read it. Next one, surprisingly, because in my head, this is a category that I really like. Watch a lot of horror movies with this element in particular, but as I was trying to figure out what my favorite book of this category is, I didn't have as many to pick from, although I do love my current favorite, and that is a cannibalistic horror. I, in theory, love cannibal stories, but I realized a lot of the ones I have read, I didn't like. The ones I didn't like, well, not necessarily didn't like, well, A Certain Hunger by Chelsea Summers. I hated that book. Okay? And then The Lamb by Lucy Rose was very mid to me. So there's 2 cannibalistic books. Don't bother recommending them to me because I've read them and was not blown away. The only one so far that I have loved enough to give a 4.5 star to is The Eyes Are the Best Part by Monica Kim. And this is quite, I don't want to say light cannibalism, but very targeted cannibalism, because the cannibalism revolves around one particular body part, and that is an eyeball. So it's not like a full-blown eating somebody's whole body type of cannibalism. It's a very targeted, very specific type of appetite that our main character has. So in the story, we're following our main character, Ji-won, and in the beginning of the story, her father ends up leaving the family and divorces from the mother, and it leaves the mother and Ji-won and her sister very distraught, and there's a big hole in this family, and her mother is so distraught over this, cannot even speak a single word without bursting into tears, and her sister is younger than her, so it ends up kind of becoming Ji-won's responsibility to mother her own mother and kind of get her mom through this and try to pick up the pieces of her family and also take care of her sister at the same time. And this is all happening while Ji-won is just starting college, so it's a very tumultuous period for her and a very transitional one in her life. Her mother ends up getting a white boyfriend who is disgusting and gross and very much fetishizes Asian women and is very inappropriate with the daughters as well. But he's gross, he's nasty. But then one day, Ji-won notices that she starts to become very obsessed with eyeballs. Her mother had kind of somewhat forced Ji-won to eat the eyeball of a fish because that is considered good luck in their culture. But that kind of ends up evolving into Ji-won being obsessed with the idea of eating human eyeballs, and particularly blue eyeballs, and particularly eyeballs that look quite similar to Ji-won's mom's boyfriend's eyeballs. So she starts to spiral into this obsessiveness over eyeballs and eating them, and she has these very bizarre, weird nightmares that are very visceral, very body horror. And overall, I really enjoyed the story. I liked the social commentary. I liked the body horror. I had a really great time with this. My only issue, the reason it's not a 5-star book for me, is again, similarly with Into the Drowning Deep, the ending ended up tying up a little bit too quick. There was a couple other things I wanted to be touched on. There was a couple too many conveniences for our main character, but otherwise really enjoyed this story. Next niche subgenre is claustrophobic. So I guess this is like a little bit more, maybe like a niche element in a book, but I recently read From Below by Darcy Coates. And when I tell you that this is the most claustrophobic, the most suffocating book I have ever read, it's not an exaggeration, okay? If you have a fear of drowning, which I do, this might be the most effective book for you, because in the story we're following this crew who is going on a journey on a ship with a documentary in mind, so kind of aligns a little bit with Into the Drowning Deep. But they are planning on making a documentary because back in the day, in like 1928, there was a ship that sailed that got lost at sea, and they believe that they know where the ship is. So they want to make a documentary of them going back out to this ship location and seeing what they find. So that's the setup of the story, and it has a lot of description of these people putting on their diving gear and a lot of description of what diving entails. I am somebody who had no idea how much diving entails, and I feel like I learned a lot from this book. I feel like the author did do some research into how diving is done and all of that, so I feel like I learned quite a bit as well. But very much this like claustrophobic, suffocating feel of these people going into the sea in these diving suits and into this sunken ship. There were just so many moments where there was just complete loss of senses, where it's pitch black, where at certain points they stop being able to hear each other, and it's just very sense deprivating. We flip back and forth between this current timeline of this documentary crew going out to the sunken ship, and then we flip to 1928, the lead up of the ship sinking, and what happened to the crew, how they slowly devolved and slowly kind of lost their minds, got maybe a little bit of cabin fever. So there's also that claustrophobic, isolating feel of even just being stuck on a boat, let alone being in the water and all those other things. But there's a certain aspect too where back in the day there's this really thick fog, and even that was just so suffocating. Just every aspect of this book is so claustrophobic and so suffocating. The writing, the descriptions, the atmosphere just really made you feel it, and it just felt so heavy. So if you want a book that feels like that, this is the book. That's not to say that this was a perfect book for me. I did also end up giving this 4 stars, had some issues with the ending. I do feel like this book was a little bit too long, where it just kind of got a little bit dragged by the end. But I do really also like the direction that this book went in, and I don't feel like I've read anything like that before. And that's all I want to say there, because I don't really want to say much else. I think it's fun to go into this without really knowing at all, having any idea where this book is going to go. So, loved that. If you want a claustrophobic read, this is the one. So, the very last one, and this is a little bit of a stretch, but I just need to talk about this book. So, I listed this for an existential horror. So what does that even mean? Existential horror is a little bit harder, in my opinion, to pinpoint and to find examples for, but it's just the idea of horror surrounding existentialism. Existentialism in general is just a philosophy about kind of the anxiety and dread of living, of human existence, of having a purpose in life. It revolves around themes that question the meaning of life, question identity, and more importantly, question reality itself. And that is very much what this book does and is, in my opinion, because I feel like this book, well, let me tell you the book, Tear by Erica McKean. Love this book so much. I feel like this is the epitome of existential horror, because I feel like our character very much ends up going through derealization and depersonalization. And this book was just, wow. This book is so incredibly unique. The book follows our main character, Francesca, and she is starting college, and she is living at a house off campus, and her room is the basement. One day, she is hanging out in her room in the basement and kind of going through it. Feels very much kind of like depression. And she decides she's going to go upstairs, but when she goes up the stairs, she realizes that she cannot get out because the door no longer has a doorknob. So she is virtually stuck in this room in her basement. So in her being stuck in this basement, she reflects a little bit, and we get the stories of her growing up. And they don't, it's not like she went through a bunch of like trauma, like intense trauma that you would expect. No like essay or anything like that. She just dealt with having, one, an absent parent, and then two, the parent that was present was not emotionally present. So she grew up with a mother who was very detached from her emotionally. It seemed like the mother probably went through a bit of depression. So our main character essentially was raised by her grandparents for a very long time until she's 7 or 8 and her father decides to come back into her life. So now she has a parent that feels like a stranger. So it just, for me, I don't know if it's just because these themes hit home for me, but the themes and the way that Erica McKean was able to put into words very specific feelings and very specific emotions was not only just amazing to read, but the way she words these things also is just so beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. The prose of the story is delicious. I had so many annotations reading this book of just lines that the way that they were written, I wanted to eat up, okay? I felt this book on such a visceral level. And the story ends up, we get more stories of her growing up and stuff and how that connects. And eventually it ends up getting extremely weird and extremely bizarre and very much what the hell is going on here. Very wicked body horror at times, which was very unexpected, but very a pleasant surprise. So it ends up becoming very disorienting and bizarre. At a certain point, it's so bizarre that I was like, I don't know, I'm just here now. But the way that Erica McKean writes is just so incredibly unique, and it's just something you have to experience. Actually, let me pull out my book and read to you guys the very first line, or the very first paragraph. I annotated the very first paragraph in this book, okay? Here's how the story opens after the prologue. The basement was dark in a blinding way, in a thick physical way. It pressed on Frances. Oh, I called her Francesca. Her name's Frances. Anyways. It pressed on Frances, on her hair and clothes and skin. It snuck into her nose, climbed like a beetle into her ears, clung to the wet corners of her eyes. The darkness was a paste along her tongue. It was phlegm that she spat into the sink and urine that she pissed into the toilet. The darkness was the palm of her hand spread out and invisible in front of her eyes. She knew only by wiggling her fingers that the hand was there, by the texture of skin on air. By touch, she knew she existed. Blah, 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 blah. Oh my God, you guys. Like, the writing, if you liked that, the writing is so good. If you didn't like that, the writing will not be good for you. But I loved it. I ate it up. I have so many annotations in this book of just lines that I loved. Loved how she described so much in this book. So incredibly unique. And I plead for people to read that book because criminally underrated, criminally underhyped. So that is it. That is all of the books that I have to share with you guys. That is my new set of very specific, very niche subgenres of horror and my favorite books in those categories. If you've read any of these books, let me know what you thought of them in the comments down below. If you have any recommendations for any of the categories, let us know down below. If there's any super niche subgenres that you want me to talk about in the next part, let me know, and I will keep that in mind for the next video. So that is it. That is everything for today. As always, thank you so much for spending some of your time with me while I sit down and talk about books. If you haven't yet, please give the video a like, subscribe for future content, turn on the bell notification, all the fun YouTube things that help your girl out, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye!